In the annals of human cruelty, few names strike with the same jolt as that of Gaius, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus, Caligula. His very name has become shorthand for a reign steeped in bloodlust, caprice, and the kind of excess that makes even seasoned historians shift uncomfortably in their chairs. But this is not just a story about Rome's mad emperor. It is a study in the corrosive alchemy of power, how the intoxicating brew of authority, adoration, and fear can turn a man into something almost unrecognizable, a figure more monstrous than mortal. The year was 37 AD, and the Roman Empire stretched farther than any civilization before it. From the cold shores of Britain to the fertile banks of the Nile, from the rugged hills of Spain to the deserts of Syria, Rome's legions had brought vast swaths of the known world under its dominion. Its cities gleamed with marble, its aqueducts carried life-giving water across continents, and its laws governed millions. Yet beneath this grandeur ran an undercurrent of instability, for the imperial crown had become a dangerous prize one that conferred divine power and mortal peril in equal measure. It was into this volatile arena that Caligula stepped at just 24 years of age, inheriting the throne from his adoptive grandfather, Emperor Tiberius. His accession seemed, to many Romans, the dawn of a golden age. He was the son of Germanicus, the beloved general whose victories had brought pride to the legions. His mother, Agrippina the elder, was a symbol of Roman dignity and lineage. His bloodline ran directly from Augustus, the first emperor, through a web of marriages and adoptions that had bound the Julio-Claudian dynasty into the very bones of the empire. From the moment he donned the purple, Caligula was greeted with an enthusiasm bordering on reverence. The Senate, weary from Tiberius's paranoid tyranny, welcomed him with open arms. Crowds filled the streets, shouting his name as though Rome had been rescued from the brink. Even foreign envoys reported home with tales of the young emperor's charm and eloquence. Speaking of a leader who might unite the grandeur of Augustus with the courage of Germanicus, for the first months, this optimism seemed justified. Caligula released political prisoners, recalled exiles, and ordered the imperial accounts published for public scrutiny, gestures of transparency rare in any era. He distributed lavish bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, the city cohorts, and even the fire brigades, securing the loyalty of those who held Rome's safety in their hands. In the amphitheaters, he gave the people spectacles they could not have imagined: days-long festivals of chariot races, gladiatorial contests, and exotic beast hunts, based on a scale that even Tiberius had never dared attempt. But in these grand entertainments, there were already flickers of something darker. On the surface, Caligula laughed and applauded like any citizen enthralled by the spectacle. Yet his laughter was too sharp, lingering after the crowd's cheer had faded, as though the sight of blood in the sand gave him a private satisfaction. Eyewitnesses later claimed they saw his gaze following the crimson trails as they pooled beneath dying men. His expression unreadable, almost serene. Ancient historians, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio would later write that these were the first glimpses of a dangerous undercurrent in the emperor's soul. These men, separated by decades from the events they described, nevertheless relied on testimony from those who had stood close enough to Caligula to hear his whispers and see the flicker in his eyes. Their accounts suggest that even in these honeymoon months, when hope still clung to his name, there was a sense, felt but unspoken, that his enjoyment of power was not rooted in responsibility or honor, but in the pleasure of control over life and death for the people of Rome, though such whispers were easy to dismiss. After the cold, fearful reign of Tiberius, the warmth of public games and the young emperor's accessibility were intoxicating. Caligula walked among the people with little ceremony, shaking hands, addressing commoners directly, and even joining in their celebrations. To the average Roman citizen, he seemed a man of the people, a leader who could laugh, weep, and revel alongside them. They could not know that this ease was only a mask, and that beneath it was a mind already shaped by the cutthroat politics of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. They could not yet see the slow shift that would take place when the applause of the crowd would no longer be enough, and the emperor would crave something far more dangerous, the sound of their screams. To understand a man Rome would one day call a monster, we must begin not with the emperor, but with the boy Gaius, son of Germanicus, born into a world where survival meant mastering the art of smiling at those who might poison your cup. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was a family of emperors and generals, of heroes sung by poets and tyrants, cursed by historians. Augustus, Caligula's great-grandfather, had forged the empire through calculated violence and brilliant statecraft. His successor, Tiberius, ruled with paranoia so deep it seeped into every corridor of the Palatine, a ruler who saw daggers in every shadow and acted before the steel could be drawn. Caligula's father, Germanicus, was a different kind of figure, beloved by soldiers, adored by the people. A commander whose victories on the Rhine and in Germania had made him a living legend. The legions idolized him, and perhaps that popularity was precisely why he died young in Antioch under circumstances that smelled of poison and political convenience. Ancient rumor pointed to Tiberius himself, whispering that the old emperor could not tolerate the popularity of a younger rival. Caligula's mother, Agrippina the elder, was no less formidable. Proud, politically astute, and fiercely loyal to her late husband's memory, she became a quiet but dangerous opponent of Tiberius. For that, she paid the price, exiled to the barren island of Pandateria, where she was starved into submission and eventually death. As for Caligula's two elder brothers, Nero and Drusus, they too fell victim to the machinery of imperial suspicion, imprisoned and executed on charges so flimsy they would barely fill a scroll. By the time Caligula reached adolescence, his family had been all but wiped away. Only he remained, a young man who had learned the value of appearing harmless. His survival was due, in no small part, to theater, both literal and political. Caligula knew how to charm, how to perform the role of the harmless youth who posed no threat to Tiberius's power. It was during his childhood, spent alongside his father's legions on the northern frontier, that he acquired the nickname that would cling to him forever: Caligula, Little Boot. Soldiers had dressed him in miniature armor and sandals, laughing as he marched beside them like a mascot of war. They adored him for it, unaware they were shaping a child's fascination with the military rituals of discipline, obedience, and death. But the Roman frontier was not a playground. From a young age, Caligula witnessed the raw brutality of Rome's wars-burned villages. Corpses left as warnings, prisoners executed without ceremony. For most children, such scenes might have been nightmares to forget. For Caligula, they became the background music of his youth. The quiet lessons that life was cheap and authority absolute. Tiberius, ever the wary patriarch, kept the young Caligula under watch. Yet in the boy's apparent lack of ambition, the old emperor saw no immediate danger. Still, there was an unease in his judgment, a suspicion he put into words when he reportedly told his advisors, "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people." The viper would bide its time. Caligula learned to navigate the treacherous court of Capri, where Tiberius retreated in his later years. Capri was a place of marble and luxury, but also of whispered accusations, sudden disappearances, and the kind of entertainments Rome preferred not to speak of. To survive, there was to master silence, patience, and the art of making oneself invisible until the right moment. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, whether by natural causes or, as some claimed, by suffocation at Caligula's own hand, the path to power lay open. Caligula emerged from the shadows, not as the harmless youth the empire thought it knew, but as the heir to an empire stretching from the storm-lashed coasts of Britannia to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. The Senate, weary of suspicion and bloodshed, greeted him with genuine relief. They believed, naively, that the last surviving son of Germanicus would rule with his father's honor and his mother's dignity. They could not yet imagine that the boy who once paraded in little boots would soon trample the empire underfoot. When Caligula first took the throne, it was as though Rome had been released from a long, suffocating nightmare. The heavy, joyless atmosphere of Tiberius's final years gave way to the excitement of a new era, and the people clung to the hope that the young emperor would restore the vitality of the empire. He began with sweeping gestures designed to charm every class of Roman society. Political prisoners were freed, exiles welcomed home, trials halted, treason charges dismissed. The imperial treasury's figures, long hidden under Tiberius, was published openly for the people to see. The very act seemed to say, "I have nothing to hide," to secure the loyalty of the forces that truly kept an emperor alive, the Praetorian Guard. The urban cohorts and the fire brigades Caligula distributed lavish bonuses. Gold flowed from the imperial coffers as though it were inexhaustible. This generosity bought him not just safety, but adoration. For the guards who now saluted him also saw him as a benefactor in the Forum. Senators found themselves treated with a courtesy absent for years. Caligula attended meetings in person, spoke eloquently, and even listened. Quality Tiberius had perfected the art of avoiding. The people, too, saw changes almost overnight. Public entertainment flourished on a scale that bordered on the fantastical. Gladiatorial games ran from sunrise to sunset, the sands soaked in blood as fighters from across the empire clashed to the death. Exotic animals, lions from Numidia, leopards from Anatolia, elephants from the African interior, were paraded and slaughtered for the crowd's delight. Caligula himself presided over these spectacles, dressed in gleaming robes, his expression alight with enjoyment. He was not content to sit passively on his imperial dais. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the combat, lips curled in what looked, to many, like the pure joy of a man entertaining his people. But there was something in that joy, a lingering gaze on the fallen, a laugh that came a heartbeat too late, stretching a fraction too long that hinted at a deeper appetite in the evenings. The emperor's presence extended beyond politics and entertainment. Banquets returned to the opulence of earlier imperial days, overflowing tables, rivers of wine, musicians and dancers in every corner. The public works, too, surged forward. He ordered the restoration of the theater of Pompey, commissioned a new amphitheater, and completed projects abandoned by Tiberius. Foreign ambassadors left Rome impressed, writing home about a ruler who seemed both clever and approachable, a rare combination in imperial politics. They could not have known that beneath the golden surface, something was beginning to twist. Even in these months of goodwill, careful eyes noticed unsettling details. Servants whispered of the emperor's habit of returning alone to the empty amphitheater at night, walking among the deserted seats and staring out at the silent arena where men had died only hours earlier. His footsteps echoed in the stone corridors, lingering where blood had soaked into the sand to most of Rome. These were harmless eccentricities of a young man intoxicated by his sudden elevation. But to those who had lived long enough to see how power corrupts, these were the first murmurs of warning, the sound of a distant storm. For while the honeymoon emperor still basked in the adoration of his people, he was already learning a lesson that would shape the rest of his reign. The crowd's cheers could be sweet, but the cries of the powerless were sweeter still. The turning point came without warning. It was late in 37 AD, just months after Caligula's coronation, when the young emperor was struck by a sudden and violent illness. Ancient sources disagree on its nature. Some say it was a fever, others that it was poison slipped into his food by political rivals. Whatever its cause, it nearly killed him. For weeks he lay in his bed, pale and delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness while the empire held its breath. In those days, Rome prepared itself for yet another succession crisis. The Praetorian Guard kept the city under tight watch. The Senate whispered about naming a replacement. The people, still in the flush of their love for him, prayed at the temples. When Caligula finally recovered, there was a collective sigh of relief. But those closest to him noticed a difference immediately. The man who rose from that bed was not the same one who had lain down in it. The warmth in his eyes had cooled to something harder, sharper. His smile, still frequent, no longer seemed to reach the depths it once had. Historians have long debated whether this illness altered him physically or merely stripped away the last of his restraint. Some suggest the fever may have caused neurological damage. Others argue it was the brush with death that changed him, that the knowledge he had nearly been undone so soon after taking power sparked a desperate need to assert his dominance over every aspect of Roman life. Whatever the truth, it is here that the line between the generous young ruler and the notorious tyrant begins to blur. The first signs were subtle. The senator who had publicly speculated about Caligula's survival vanished without explanation. Rumors surfaced that the emperor had ordered his execution, though no official record marked his death. Political opponents found themselves suddenly exiled or stripped of titles, placed by men whose loyalty to Caligula was absolute. And then came the executions. They began in the quiet of the palace, carried out behind closed doors. But soon the emperor saw no need for secrecy. Trials became a formality, often dispensed with altogether. Those who displeased him, no matter how trivial the offense, were paraded before the public and dispatched in brutal fashion. The man who had once walked the streets like a friend to the people now surrounded himself with guards. He stopped attending Senate meetings in person, preferring to summon senators to his palace, where the air was thick with intimidation. His behavior toward the games changed, too. If, in the first months, they had been a gift to the people, they now seemed designed for his own gratification. Caligula would have the defeated gladiators executed on his personal command, sometimes for reasons unrelated to the fight itself. A gesture, a word, even a glance he did not like could turn survival into death. He began to blur the lines between the arena and the city. Prisoners condemned for petty crimes were thrown into the games, not as trained fighters, but as unarmed victims for wild beasts. The crowd still cheered some out of habit, others out of fear, but an undercurrent of unease began to spread. Those who had once prayed for his recovery now whispered of a different kind of sickness, one that no physician could cure, for in Caligula's mind, something had shifted. Rome was no longer his to serve, it was his to own. And in owning it, he would test how far a man could go when there were no boundaries left to cross. If Caligula's illness had cracked the mask he once wore, the months that followed shattered it completely. The emperor, who had begun his reign with generosity, now seemed to delight in reminding Rome that its fate rested solely in his hands, that those hands could close at any moment. The transformation was most visible in the Senate, where once he had treated senators as partners in governance, he now treated them as actors in a cruel performance staged for his amusement. He mocked their speeches, interrupted their debates, and forced the most respected men of Rome to run beside his chariot like slaves, panting and humiliated. As the crowd looked on one occasion he invited several senators to dine with him in the palace. The feast began lavishly, golden platters, rare wines, the air heavy with incense. Midway through the meal, Caligula began laughing. When one of the guests asked what had amused him, he replied with chilling casualness, "I was thinking. With one word, I could have all of you killed right now." This was not an idle boast. Senators knew too well that such whims had become death sentences. Many had already disappeared summoned to the palace and never seen again. The fear was constant, suffocating, and Caligula seemed to breathe it in like perfume. In the arena, his cruelty turned into spectacle. He developed a habit of halting games midway and ordering the execution of entire groups of prisoners. Not because the crowd demanded it, but because he wanted it. If the day's schedule of bloodshed was insufficient, he would have the first few rows of spectators, usually the poorer citizens, seized and thrown to the beasts to fill the gap. The message was unmistakable. No one, not even the ordinary citizens who once adored him, was beyond his reach. But perhaps the most disturbing change was his appetite for humiliation, not just punishment. In one notorious episode, Caligula ordered an old political enemy to stand beside him during a public festival, dressed in rags, while the emperor whispered insults in his ear for the amusement of those close enough to hear. When the man finally broke down in tears, Caligula smiled as though savoring a rare vintage. Even his private life began to take on the same tone of dominance and disregard. Marriages meant nothing. He would take the wives of senators openly, sometimes returning them the next day, sometimes not at all. The line between emperor and god blurred as he began insisting on divine honors, not posthumously as tradition dictated, but during his lifetime. Temples were rededicated to him, statues of the gods replaced with his likeness in the streets. The people still shouted his name, but the tone had changed. The cheers were louder when he passed, but only because silence might be mistaken for dissent. Rome had learned the truth about its emperor. The boy in little boots had grown into a man who wore cruelty like armor. And the mask of benevolence would never return. The city was no longer waiting for the storm. The storm was here. God on earth by 39 AD. Caligula's belief in his own divinity was no longer an eccentric whisper in the palace corridors. It was imperial policy. The temples of Rome, once dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, began to bear his image. Priests who had served the gods for generations now found themselves performing rituals in honor of a living man. Alexandria, where the cult of divine rulers was long established, Caligula ordered statues of himself erected alongside the great deities of Egypt. In Rome, he had the heads of famous statues replaced with his own likeness, as if the gods themselves had merely been waiting for his arrival to be complete. But he went further than symbolism. Caligula began to dress as the gods. He claimed kinship with appearing in public as Apollo with a lyre, as Mercury with winged sandals, as Hercules with the lion's skin over his shoulders. In one festival, he dressed as Venus, painted and jeweled, his robes shimmering in the sunlight as he paraded through the streets. The crowd roared approval, or at least it sounded like approval. In truth, the cheers were laced with fear, for any failure to celebrate could be construed as blasphemy. He was not content merely to be worshipped. He demanded proof of devotion. Citizens were required to make offerings to his divinity. Senators were ordered to swear oaths, not just to the emperor, but to the god Caligula. Those who hesitated found themselves stripped of titles, exiled, or worse. The emperor's appetite for demonstrating his godlike power bled into military affairs. In one of the most infamous episodes of his reign, Caligula led his legions to the northern coast of Gaul, declaring that they would invade Britannia. The soldiers prepared for battle, but instead of crossing the channel, Caligula ordered them to gather seashells on the shore, proclaiming they were the spoils of the ocean, conquered for Rome. Whether this was a calculated insult to the army or a private joke only he understood, it humiliated the legions who had once marched with his father. Germanicus. At home, the treasury groaned under the weight of his extravagance. His building projects grew ever more bizarre, floating bridges for him to ride his horse across the Bay of Baiae, golden statues, and a palace that connected directly to the temple of Castor and Pollux so that he could live among the gods. The cost of these whims was extracted through crushing taxes, forced loans, and outright confiscation of property from Rome's wealthiest citizens. Caligula had transformed the empire into a stage, with himself as the central deity in a drama that no one dared end. Yet even gods can make enemies, and in the Senate, the whispers were growing louder. The Praetorian Guard, too, began to murmur. The soldiers who once swore loyalty to Little Boot were beginning to remember that emperors, divine or not, could bleed. The question was no longer whether Caligula would fall, but when and how bloody the ending would be. The edge of the Caligula by the dawn of 41 AD. The empire was a palace balanced on a razor's edge. Caligula had alienated nearly every faction that mattered. The Senate loathed him for his humiliations and confiscations. The people resented the crushing taxes and the constant demands for displays of loyalty. Even the Praetorian Guard, the very men paid to protect him, were restless. Their bonuses spent and their patience worn thin by the emperor's whims. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was suffocating. Caligula trusted no one, moving through corridors lined with armed guards. His food tasted for poison, his chambers checked for hidden assassins. Yet, paradoxically, he seemed to court danger. He spoke openly about replacing the Senate entirely, about moving the capital to Alexandria, where he would be worshipped without question. He taunted senators in public, called them slaves in front of the mob, and stripped powerful families of their wealth with a smile. The games had grown even more grotesque. It was no longer enough for Caligula to watch. He wanted to direct the violence like a conductor leading an orchestra. The fights bored him. He would order executions on the spot. The beasts seemed too sluggish. He would have fresh victims thrown to them. He once delayed the distribution of grain of vital supply for Rome, simply to watch the panic ripple through the city. But the most dangerous shift was his treatment of the Praetorian Guard. Their commander, Cassius Chaerea, had endured months of insults from the emperor, who mocked his voice and called him weak in front of the troops. Caligula turned his cruelty into ritual, signing Chaerea degrading watchwords for the day phrases like Venus or Priapus, forcing the hardened soldier to repeat them to his men. It was a small thing in the scale of imperial politics, but humiliation has a way of hardening into steel. The conspiracy formed quietly, almost invisibly. A handful of senators, a few palace officials, and crucially, members of the guard. They would strike during the Palatine Games, when the emperor would be distracted and vulnerable. The risk was enormous. Failure meant certain death, but so did inaction. And so, as the festival approached, Rome became a city of masks. Casus, the conspirators laughed at the emperor's jokes, applauded his appearances, and saluted him as a god. Behind the smiles, hands tightened around daggers. The empire's most dangerous man was about to discover that even gods walk to their doom when they mistake fear for worship. Blood in the Cort rest. The day was bright and cold. The air sharp with the scent of incense from the Palatine Games. Caligula arrived in full splendor. Draped in a purple cloak, a crown of laurel leaves glinting in the winter sun. The crowd erupted, some in genuine awe, most in fearful obedience. He basked in the noise, the cheers rolling over him like a tide throughout the morning. The games unfolded, chariot races, beast hunts, and staged naval skirmishes. Caligula laughed, jeered, and shouted commands from his gilded seat, playing the God King for all of Rome. He had no reason to suspect that in the shadowed corridors of the palace, men were preparing to end him. When the spectacle paused for the midday break, the emperor rose to return to his quarters. A small escort followed him through the covered passageways beneath the palace. The torches sputtered in the draught, casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was here, away from the crowd's eyes, that Cassius Chaerea stepped forward. "Caesar," Chaerea said, his voice steady. Caligula turned, perhaps expecting another of the commander's obsequious greetings. Instead, Chaerea's dagger flashed, driving deep into the emperor's neck. The first blow stunned him, but he did not fall immediately. "Counsay," he cried, out weathering rage, shock, or disbelief. No one could tell. Others rushed in, tribunes, guards, even freedmen who had joined the plot. Steel rose and fell in a frenzy. Blades pierced his chest, his abdomen, his face. The god emperor, worshipped in marble and gold, was reduced to bleeding flesh on the cold stone floor. The killing did not stop with him. His wife, Caesonia, was murdered, and their infant daughter dashed against a wall, a grim act meant to erase his bloodline entirely. Outside, chaos erupted. The conspirators moved quickly, sealing off the area and attempting to secure control before the news spread. But Rome was not a city easily contained. Whispers became shouts, and soon the mob surged toward the palace. Uncertain whether to celebrate, mourn, or loot, by nightfall, the Senate debated restoring the Republic. Some saw this as the perfect moment to end the line of emperors altogether. But the Praetorian Guard had other plans. In a move that stunned the Senate, they declared Claudius Caligula's uncle, and a man long dismissed as a harmless fool, the new emperor. Power, once again, remained in imperial hands. Caligula's body was buried in haste. But the legend of his reign was only beginning. In the months to come, stories would spread, some true, others wildly exaggerated, of the god who became a monster and the monster who believed himself a god. Rome had survived him, but it would never forget the lesson of his rule, that even the mightiest empire can be bent to the will of a single man. So long as fear outweighs hope. The shadow he left behind in the aftermath of Caligula's assassination. Rome was a city in a strange state of mourning, if mourning is the right word for a mixture of relief, confusion, and whispered disbelief. The man who had dominated every public and private space for nearly 4 years was suddenly gone, and the silence felt unnatural. The Senate wasted no time in trying to erase his memory. Decrees were passed condemning his acts. His statues were toppled or recarved, his name chiseled from public inscriptions. Officially, it was as if the reign of Gaius, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus had never happened. But memory does not obey decrees, and the people of Rome remembered. Some remembered the boy who had once walked among them without guards, who had brought joy to the games and hope to the provinces. Others remembered the man who turned temples into shrines to himself, who could order a death with a glance, who had reduced the Senate to trembling actors in his cruel theater. Stories multiplied, each more grotesque than the last. Whether true or invented, they took on a life of their own. Caligula eating gold, Caligula conversing with the moon, Caligula planning to make his horse a consul. The man became a myth. The myth became a warning. For the Praetorian Guard, his death was both a victory and a cautionary tale. They had removed a tyrant, but they had also ensured the survival of the imperial system that had birthed him. By placing Claudius on the throne, they kept the flow of gold, power, and privilege intact. The Republic would not return. Rome had crossed too far into the age of emperors in the provinces. News of his death was slow to arrive, and when it did, reactions varied wildly. Some cities mourned sincerely, others staged celebrations. In Alexandria, the city Caligula had once threatened to make his capital festivals broke out in the streets. As for Caligula's legacy, it would never settle into a single shape. He was proof of how absolute power corrupts absolutely. To others, he was a madman whose reign was an aberration, not a pattern. But for those who had lived under him, the truth was simpler. He had been the sun around which Rome revolved, burning too brightly, consuming everything in his reach, and finally collapsing into darkness. Yet, even in death, he was not entirely gone. His reign left behind a blueprint of fear as a political tool, of spectacle as a means of control, of the emperor as both god and executioner. Future rulers would study him, some to avoid his mistakes, others to imitate his grip on power. Rome had survived Caligula, but it had also learned how easily it could produce another. The echo through history's centuries past, and yet Caligula's name never faded into the dust of forgotten emperors. It became a byword for cruelty, excess, and the intoxicating madness of absolute power. Ancient historians, Suetonius, Cassius, Dio, Josephus, painted him as both villain and curiosity, their works dripping with scandalous details that blurred the line between fact and rumor. Some scholars argued that much of what was written about him was exaggerated, the product of senatorial hatred and political revenge. After all, no emperor's reputation was safe in the hands of those he had humiliated. Perhaps he had not truly declared war on the ocean. Oh, perhaps the seashells gathered by his soldiers were part of a symbolic ritual misunderstood by later generations. Perhaps the stories of incest, divine delusions, and casual executions were embroidered over decades, until they became moral lessons rather than liable history. But whether Caligula was as monstrous as his legend claimed, or merely the victim of history's most vindictive smear campaign, one fact remained. He had ruled in a way that made such stories believable. He had embraced spectacle, blurred the line between governance and theater, and wielded fear with the precision of a blade. In doing so, he had ensured that truth and myth would forever be tangled in his legacy. In modern times, his name would resurface whenever a ruler appeared who seemed drunk on power, untouchable, and unmoored from reality. Psychologists would speculate about his mental states of epilepsy, his hyperthyroidism, bipolar disorder, or simply the corrosive isolation of absolute authority. Dramatists and filmmakers would resurrect him, exaggerating his depravity until it became a cultural shorthand for tyranny gone mad. Yet, for all the fascination with his excesses, there was a quieter, darker truth to his story. Caligula had not risen from nowhere. Rome had made him. The adoration of the people, the obedience of the legions, the flattery of the Senatala had built the pedestal from which he ruled. When he became a god in his own mind, it was only because the empire had already taught him he was more than mortal. And so, his reign lingered, not just as a tale of one man's downfall, but as a warning etched into the very bones of Roman history. When fear becomes the coin of the realm, and power the only god, the empire will always have another Caligula waiting in the wings. The warning that endured the centuries after Caligula's death. Rome would see other tyrants Domitian, Commodus, Caracalla, accused in their time of the same arrogance, cruelty, and godlike pretensions. Yet none would eclipse the shadow cast by Gaius Caesar Germanicus. His reign was not the longest, nor the bloodiest, but it had become the purest distillation of imperial excess in the Roman imagination. The senators who had survived him passed down their accounts with a venom that ensured no future ruler would forget the dangers of mocking the aristocracy too openly. The Praetorian Guard remembered him as both a benefactor who had showered them with rewards and a reckless master whose insults could turn loyalty into treachery. The common people, for their part, remembered him as entertainment incarnate, sometimes glorious, often terrifying. In the ruins of the Palatine Hill, whispers persisted for generations. Some claimed his ghost wandered the palace at night, dressed as he had in life, sometimes in the armor of a general, sometimes in the robes of a goddess's laughter, echoing through the empty halls. Sailors swore they saw him standing on the shore of Gaul, still collecting seashells for his war against Neptune. By the Middle Ages, his story had transformed into a moral allegory in manuscripts and sermons. To Christian writers, he was the image of the pagan world's decay, a man who made himself a god only to be struck down like any mortal. In the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered Suetonius and Dio. Caligula's notoriety flared again, this time as both a figure of horror and a source of lurid fascination. The truth of the man, whether mad, cruel, misunderstood, or all three, was lost beneath layers of performance and propaganda. But perhaps that was fitting. Caligula had always been a creature of spectacle, and even in death, he ruled the stage. His life left behind a question that every empire, ancient or modern, would one day face. Is it the ruler who becomes monstrous, or the system that shapes them into one? Rome never answered that question. History hasn't either. The cycle of empires long after Rome's marble had crumbled and its legions faded into dust. Caligula's name still carried weights spoken in the same breath as Nero, Attila, or any ruler accused of crossing the invisible line between power and madness. Historians began to notice something unsettling. The story of Caligula was not unique to Rome. Again and again, across centuries and continents, the same pattern emerged. A leader would rise sometimes through merit, sometimes through birthright, and be carried to power on waves of public devotion. The adulation would grow, the opposition would weaken, and the court around them would learn that flattery was safer than truth. Soon, the leader's image would be everywhere, on coins, in monuments, in the words of every public address. They would speak of destiny, of divine favor, of a personal connection to the soul of the nation. And then always would come the tightening of the fist in Caligula's time. That meant purges of the Senate, mock trials, and executions on a whim. In later ages, it meant gulags, firing squads, political prisons. The costumes changed, but the script was the same. The cult of personality, once born, had its own momentum, and reality bent to the will of its central figure. What made Caligula's story dangerous was not simply that he was cruel. It was that his cruelty was entertaining. The games, the spectacles, the shocking pronouncements, they kept the people's eyes fixed on him. Constant distraction from the erosion of institutions. Tyranny wrapped in theater could last longer than tyranny built on fear alone, because it gave the crowds something to cheer for, even as it devoured them. This was the true warning of his reign. Not that madness can reach the throne, but that, when it does, it may arrive smiling, dazzling, and draped in gold. And by the time the smile fades, the empire may have already traded its liberty for the thrill of the show. Rome never forgot him. Neither did the world, 'cause in every age, somewhere, there is a leader learning his lessons, whether they realize it or not. The curtain falls, the stage resets, and the next Caligula waits in the wings.